All right, today we're going to dive into a really fascinating and, well, pretty complex question. Did colonial-era Hong Kong actually have the rule of law? Now, it sounds like a simple yes or no question, but trust me, the answer is anything but. So let's get right into it.
So let's start with this really provocative quote from a former president of Brazil. "From my friends, anything. From my enemies, the law." Just think about that for a second. It's kind of a chilling idea, right? It suggests the law isn't about justice at all, but instead it's a weapon you use against people you don't like, while your allies get to do whatever they want.
So is that consistent with the rule of law? I mean, is it just about having laws on the books and then picking and choosing who you enforce them against? I think, our gut reaction is to say, no way. But that very question is really the launchpad for this whole discussion.
Okay, so to answer our big question, we first have to get our terms straight. And this is absolutely crucial. The rule of law is not the same thing as just law and order. Law and order, that's about, catching criminals, keeping things peaceful. The rule of law is something way, way deeper. It's about putting limits on the power of the government itself.
Here's a pretty solid definition for us to work with. Basically, the rule of law means that a society is run by clear, established laws, not just whatever the people in charge feel like doing that day. But here's the kicker, the most important part. The government, the officials, the rulers, they are also bound by those same laws. Nobody is above the law.
And another thing to remember is that the rule of law isn't like a light switch. It's not just on or off. A much better way to think about it is like daytime. Daytime might technically be from 5 a.m. to 7 p.m., but the amount of light is changing constantly. It's the same idea here. A country's commitment to the rule of law can be stronger or weaker, and it can definitely change over time.
Okay, now we're getting into the real heart of the academic debate. When legal experts talk about this, they often bring up two different ways of looking at it: a thin version and a thick version of the rule of law. And understanding this split is the key to unpacking the whole situation in colonial Hong Kong.
So what's the difference? Well, the thin view is all about the process. It asks, are the laws made public? Are they clear? Are they stable? And critically, are they applied equally to everyone, including the government? The thin view is totally morally neutral. It doesn't care if the laws are good or bad, just that the procedure is followed. But the thick view says, whoa, hold on a second. It argues that a real rule of law has to have those procedural things, plus it has to protect fundamental values, things like human rights, democracy, and real equality. For this view, the actual content of the law matters a lot.
The late British judge Tom Bingham was a huge champion of this thick view. He basically said, look, a country that uses perfectly legal, procedurally correct laws to do awful things, like Nazi Germany did, you simply can't say that country has the rule of law. And his point is really powerful, right? If your definition of rule of law can be used to describe a regime like that, then what good is the definition in the first place?
Okay, so we've got our framework, thin versus thick. Now let's take that and apply it to our case study. What did the rule of law actually look like on the ground in colonial Hong Kong? A place that was, let's not forget, run by an unelected foreign government.
Let's start with an example that really showcases the ideal. Back in 1857, there was a massive crisis. Hundreds of Europeans in Hong Kong got sick from arsenic-laced bread, all traced back to one bakery. The baker, a man named Choang Ah-Lum, was arrested. The public pressure was immense, and the Attorney General basically said he would rather hang the wrong man than fail to get a conviction.
But then, the judicial system did its job. The Chief Justice, a man named John Walter Holm, stood his ground and pushed back with this incredible line: hanging the wrong man will not further the ends of justice. And despite all that political heat, Chiang was acquitted because there just wasn't enough evidence. This is a perfect example of judicial independence, a cornerstone of even the thin version of the rule of law.
Okay, so that was the ideal. Now for the reality check. That same system, with its independent judges, existed side by side with laws that were just deeply, openly discriminatory. I mean, you had a nightly curfew that only applied to Chinese people. Punishments like flogging were only used on them. And of course, there was zero representative government. So while the legal process might have looked fair in one courtroom, the substance of the legal system as a whole completely fails any thick definition of the rule of law.
And it wasn't just things like curfews. The government made some truly awful compromises on basic human dignity. The Muay Thai system, for example, was basically a form of child slavery, where young girls were sold as domestic servants. Now, this was completely illegal under British law, but for decades, the colonial government just looked the other way to keep powerful Chinese elites happy. It's another glaring example of where the reality on the ground fell so far short of any thick idea.
So this raises a really interesting question. If the reality was so flawed, how did this idea of the rule of law become such a central part of Hong Kong's identity? Well, this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. The idea itself became a powerful tool, used very strategically by the colonial government to rule.
Okay, a super quick flyby of the history here. Britain gets Hong Kong in 1842, leases more land in 1898, and then we jump to 1967. A massive event happens that absolutely shakes the colony to its core, the 1967 riots. This moment changes pretty much everything.
The riots were violent, they were widespread, and they posed a serious challenge to the very legitimacy of British rule. So after things calmed down, the government had a huge problem. They really couldn't introduce democracy because they were worried about provoking China. So they needed a new idea, a new justification for their unelected colonial rule.
And their solution was, honestly, kind of brilliant. They decided to lean in hard on the idea of the rule of law. They started promoting it as the thing that made Hong Kong special and successful. It was a promise of stability, fairness, and predictability. But just talking about it wasn't enough. They paired this messaging campaign with a massive investment in social programs.
And this is how they made the idea real for regular people. It wasn't just some abstract legal concept anymore. It was connected to real, tangible benefits: new apartment blocks, free education, better hospitals, and huge, iconic projects like the subway system. This combination was incredibly effective. People started to connect the rule of law with good government and a better life, and that helped cement it as a core Hong Kong value.
So, after looking at the theory, the ideals, and the very messy reality, let's circle back to where we started. What's the final verdict on the rule of law in colonial Hong Kong?
And the answer really is, it's complicated. There's just no easy yes or no here. If you use that thin procedural definition, you can make a pretty strong case that, especially in its later years, colonial Hong Kong did have key elements in place. It had an independent judiciary, a government that wasn't corrupt, and predictable laws. But if you use that thick, substantive definition, the one that requires democracy, equality, and human rights, then it's just as clear that the colonial system, which was fundamentally built on an undemocratic racial hierarchy, failed that test.
So, we end right back at the beginning, but with a much, much deeper way of thinking about it. The next time you come across this question, and if you're a law student, I guarantee you will, you'll know that the very first thing you have to ask is, well, what exactly do we mean by rule of law? Are we talking about the thin version or the thick one? Because the answer you give will depend entirely on which definition you choose. Thanks for joining.